Okay, welcome to the Strange North channel. In this video, I'm going to talk about some of the gangs in the city of Toronto, Ontario. And as a quick note before I get started, everything presented in this video is based on publicly available information, and this is intended to be a general overview for people interested in the gang history of that city. As you're probably aware, Toronto is by far the largest city in Canada. It's had a lot of gang activity over the years, and there's just a ton of content there. And so this is part one of a three-part series. I've already covered major gang activity in Western Canada, and if you get some value out of this one, you might enjoy those as well. There are many criminal organizations active across Canada, and there's a bit of overlap with the West, but there are definitely different trends in gang activity in Eastern Canada. First off, Indigenous street gangs are not as dominant in this area of the country. Italian mafia-style groups are much stronger. There has been much more immigration from places like Africa and the Caribbean, and cities like Toronto and Montreal are the biggest urban centers in the country, and this perhaps allows for a greater variety of gangs. The gang landscape in Eastern Canada also seems to have been influenced more by gangs from the US, and a good example of this is the prevalence of the Crips and the Bloods in the city of Toronto. These two groups are not nearly as active in Western Canada, and of course the Crips and the Bloods originated in the US, and you've probably heard about them. The Crips were formed in Los Angeles, California in 1969, and its main founders were Raymond Washington and Stanley Williams. They formed this gang in LA's infamous South Central area in order to combat neighboring gangs that had been popping up. Since 1973, they have traditionally been associated with the color blue. Over time, they have developed into a loosely connected network of individual Crip sets, but there is no central authority governing these small independent sets. This is primarily an African-American gang, and they eventually expanded beyond LA across the United States from coast to coast and then into Canada. The Crips have had a long-standing and bitter rivalry with another gang called the Bloods, perhaps the most well-known rivalry among North American gangs. The Bloods gang also originated in the South Central region of LA, and they were formed to fight back against the Crips. The story goes that the rivalry between the two groups originated in the late 1960s, when Raymond Washington and other members of the Crips attacked Sylvester Scott and Benson Owens, two students at Centennial High School in Compton. As a result of this, Scott and Owens formed the Piru Street Boys, which was the first Blood set. The Bloods are also made up of individual independent sets, and there is no central authority as there is in the Italian Mafia, for example. Over time, these Blood sets spread across the United States and into Canada, much like the Crips. As I mentioned, the Bloods and Crips have a loose structure and no central authority, and this has helped spread the Bloods and Crips across North America. Over time, existing street gangs would simply declare allegiance and call themselves either Bloods or Crips. In the city of Toronto, Crip sets started showing up sometime in the late 1980s. In reaction to this, other gangs started becoming Blood sets. One of the first Blood sets in Toronto was the Ardwick Bloods. You also had the Young Thugs gang split into the Vaughan Road Bloods and the Pelham Park Bloods. The Southside Connection, the Y gang, and the Lanes crew all became Blood sets as well. During the 80s and 90s, Toronto had a lot of immigration from Somalia, and many of these immigrants began settling around Dixon Road and Kipling Avenue. This area started to become known as Dixon or Dixon City, and within Toronto, this area has become synonymous with Somali immigration. In fact, many Somalis in Somalia refer to Toronto as Dixon City. And this area saw the birth of Toronto's most notorious Blood set called the Dixon Bloods, also known as the Dixon City Bloods or the Dixon Goonies. They were heavily involved in weapons and drug trafficking, and they quickly found themselves at odds with other gangs in the city, such as the Rexdale Crips, the Asian Assassins, and MS-13. I'm going to talk about the Asian Assassins and MS-13 in the part 2 video. And the Dixon Bloods quickly found themselves in some high-profile violent events. On December 26 of 2005, on Toronto's busy Yonge Street, the Dixon City Bloods got into a massive shootout near a mall with the Crips-affiliated 5-Point Generalz. When the dust had settled, 6 innocent bystanders were wounded, and a 15-year-old girl named Jane Kriba was killed. This became known as the infamous Boxing Day shooting. Earlier that year, MS-13 members ambushed a group of Dixon Bloods near a nightclub in Toronto. The two groups got into an intense gunfight involving AK-47s, and Lavette Miller, a mother of 4, was killed in the crossfire. These high-profile events are just some examples of many shootings that happened that year. In 2005 alone, Toronto recorded 80 homicides and a record 52 shooting deaths. This led to the Toronto police and media labeling 2005 as the year of the gun. Referring to the highly publicized Boxing Day shooting, Detective Sergeant Savas Kirikou of the Toronto Police Service was quoted as saying, "Toronto has finally lost its innocence. I think we're going to feel this day for a long time to come." The Dixon Bloods would continue to grow and clash with other groups throughout the 2000s and 2010s. Then in 2013, there was a very high-profile event featuring this gang. In February of that year, Toronto Mayor Rob Ford was captured on video smoking crack cocaine. He initially denied this, but later admitted to doing it, and according to Ford, this was done, quote, probably in one of my drunken stupors, end quote. For the sake of moving on, I won't go into too much detail on the story, it's almost worth its own video. But Rob Ford was actually smoking crack with members of the Dixon City Bloods. Mayor Ford had wandered into a gang neighborhood with no bodyguards and smoked crack with a major gang. This was definitely an unusual event in Canadian politics, and this contributed to the legend of the Dixon City Bloods in Toronto. But later that year, in June of 2013, 42 tactical teams from 17 police agencies spread out across Toronto and Windsor and executed 39 search warrants against the Dixon Bloods. This was the culmination of a year-long investigation into the gang dubbed Project Traveler. Deputy Police Chief Mark Saunders said that at their peak, the gang had been networking with associates as far away as Edmonton. The men photographed with Rob Ford during the crack scandal were among those charged in this massive wave of arrests. This definitely weakened the gang, but they are still operating in Toronto and Windsor, and they are definitely the most infamous blood set from the Toronto area. There are definitely a lot more blood sets in Toronto, but to keep this overview moving along, I'm going to move on to the Crips gangs in the city now. One very prominent Crips affiliated gang in Toronto is the 5 Point Generalz. This group was formed in the late 90s in the area of Weston Road and Lawrence Avenue West, and the name is based on the 5 original members nicknamed the 5 Generalz. Over time they expanded and recruited local gangsters in Toronto's Mount Dennis neighborhood along with other locations along Western Road and Jane Street. The 5 Point Generalz first gained national attention during the infamous Boxing Day shooting in 2005, when they were involved in a shootout with the Dixon Bloods. As I mentioned, this event contributed to 2005 being called the Year of the Gun in Toronto and led to a wave of public support of a handgun ban in Canada. The gang was also involved in another high-profile event in 2007. On July 22nd of that year, the 5 Point Generalz got into a shootout with rival gang the Baghdad Crew at Jane Street and Shepherd Avenue, and 11-year-old Ephraim Brown was killed when he was hit in the neck by a stray bullet. In 2009, a bloody war erupted between the 5 Point Generalz and the Falstaff Crips, leaving as many as 8 people killed and numerous others wounded by gunfire. And this is just one of many examples of individual Crip sets in open conflict with each other. This gang conflict led to Toronto police launching Project Corral in 2010. This was a massive investigation that culminated in raids that led to more than 70 arrests. On June 22nd of 2018, more than 800 police officers conducted a series of raids across the Greater Toronto area, targeting the 5 Point Generalz. During these raids, they seized 78 handguns, which is the largest amount ever seized in Toronto. Police arrested 75 people and laid over 1,000 charges. This certainly disrupted their gang activity, but the 5 Point Generalz are still active in the GTA, and they are one of the most notorious Crip affiliated gangs in the city. Another prominent Crip set in Toronto is the Driftwood Crips. They originated in Toronto's notorious Jane and Finch area. Traditionally, this area has seen a lot of immigration from poor countries, and it tends to have more poverty and crime than other areas of the city. The Driftwood Crips originated in the 1980s, and they were heavily influenced by Jamaican gangster subcultures. The area of Jane and Finch has long been an area of Toronto that has become associated with gang activity, and this area really has two sides separated by Finch Avenue. North of Finch is known as Up Top, and then south of Finch is known as Down Bottom. And at one time the two sides were unified as the Driftwood Crips. Sometime in the early 90s, the Down Bottom Crips got into a conflict with another prominent Crip set in the city known as the Rexdale Crips. And so these Down Bottom Crips in Jane and Finch began identifying as Bloods, and this naturally led to tension with the Up Top Crips. Ever since, the area of Jane and Finch has had an ongoing conflict between the Up Top and the Down Bottom gangs, as well as the whole area being in conflict with other gangs throughout the city. The Driftwood Crips became heavily involved in drug and weapons distribution throughout the Greater Toronto area. By the mid-2000s, this gang was on the Toronto police radar, and they began seriously investigating the group. Things escalated on May 23rd of 2007, when 15-year-old grade 9 student Jordan Manners was fatally shot in the chest in the hallway of C.W. Jeffries High School in the Jane and Finch area. This was the first time that a student was shot and killed inside a Toronto school, and this shooting was linked to the Driftwood Crips. A few weeks later, more than 700 Toronto police officers raided several rental homes in the Jane and Finch area. This was the culmination of a year-long police investigation called Project Cryptic. In total, 95 people were arrested, and police seized $1 million worth of drugs, as well as dozens of firearms and over $200,000 in cash. This series of raids also saw the arrest of the 3 Johnson brothers, who were said to be major leaders within the Driftwood Crips. 6 of the people arrested worked at Toronto's Pearson Airport and would help smuggle contraband in and out of the country, and this showed Toronto police that this gang was a lot more organized and sophisticated than they previously thought. At the time, Toronto Police Chief Bill Blair was confident that they had decimated the Driftwood Crips, and he's quoted as saying, "The city has one less street gang to worry about." But as you might expect, the gang continued to evolve and flourish into the 2010s and even expanded outside of Toronto. The Toronto police launched another major investigation into the gang in 2016 dubbed Project Chronic. This culminated in June of 2017 when more than 800 police officers raided various locations across Ontario. In total, there were 120 arrests with about 660 charges laid. At the time, police stated that the Driftwood Crips had spread to multiple communities in Ontario outside of Toronto, as well as into Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia. Toronto police also stated that a member of the Driftwood Crips had been supplying a large quantity of fentanyl and cocaine to a network of dealers in the Sudbury area, which included a member of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. This highlighted the gang's involvement with other major criminal organizations in the city. In February of 2020, 3 youth associated with the Driftwood Crips were arrested in Kelowna, BC, with drugs, guns, and a large amount of cash, and this emphasized their influence from coast to coast. Now, there are many other prominent Crip sets in Toronto. You've got the Eglinton West Crips, the Queens Drive Crips, the Rexdale Crips, who I previously mentioned, the Mount Olive Crips, the Jamestown Crips, and many more. You could do multiple videos just on the different Crip sets within Toronto. Like I mentioned, the Driftwood Crips are based in the notorious Jane and Finch area, and this notorious neighborhood has produced many prominent Toronto rappers, many of whom were caught up in local gang life, although not necessarily Crips. Some other prominent gangs within this area are 3L, as well as the Young Buck Killaz. Starting in the 2010s, thanks to platforms like YouTube, musical artists started having access to ways of sharing their creations online without a proper label contract. The hip-hop culture in Toronto has been heavily influenced by the Chicago drill scene. One of the first rappers from this area was Robin Banks, who started posting to YouTube around 2014. Other prominent rappers that came out of this area were Posi, Houdini, Burna Bands, the Tall Up Twins, 21 Neat, as well as Pressa, who's definitely the most successful rapper to come out of Jane and Finch. In 2011, the Toronto police investigation dubbed Project Marvel saw 900 officers conduct raids and arrest 60 people across the city. The Young Buck Killaz gang was accused of funneling drugs and guns across Canada. One of the accused was a 15-year-old Pressa, as well as his older brother Boondog. On August 4th of 2015, gunmen opened fire at Drake's OVO Fest after party that left 2 people dead and 3 people critically injured. One of the men killed was rapper Slugga from Rexdale, and the Rexdale Crips had a long-standing feud with the Driftwood Crips. The rapper Slugga was hated by many of the up-top gangsters, including Pressa, who would mention his death in one of his biggest tracks released in 2021. Drake would send condolences to Slugga and address the shooting publicly, and the event was highly publicized. Toronto was developing a gangster rap culture that was not that common in the rest of Canada, something similar to what has happened in cities like Los Angeles. Things took a dark turn in the gang wars in 2016. On April 18th of that year, members of the Young Buck Killers were having a party which was crashed by members of the Queens Drive Crips, and this led to an armed standoff in the building. The Young Buck Killers then took 2 17-year-old boys hostage. These boys were accused of tipping off the Queens Drive Crips and causing the shootout. The boys were then physically and sexually assaulted and forced to play Russian roulette with a loaded gun. On April 23rd, Pressa was arrested for his involvement with these kidnappings. However, he was eventually acquitted of his charges, and it was found that the main culprits in the attack were Ty Shea Gordon and Anthony Richards. The same day that Pressa was arrested for these kidnappings, rapper Sizzlack was shot to death just days after he released a track where he makes reference to rival gang 3L from Jane and Finch. Pressa would also mention rival Sizzlack's death in his hit song Attachments from 2021. Another Toronto rapper named Seasick was murdered about a month later on March 23rd of 2016. On April 4th of 2017, popular Jane and Finch rapper Robin Banks was shot 14 times in front of a nightclub. He survived with his life but ended up permanently paralyzed and wheelchair bound. Another up-and-coming rapper from the Jane and Finch area was Houdini. On May 26 of 2020, he was murdered in downtown Toronto in a brazen daytime shooting. And there are many more stories like this. Honestly, you could talk for hours about the violence plaguing Toronto's rap scene, which is closely tied to street gangs. But I just wanted to highlight this topic briefly, and this makes the gang landscape in Toronto unique within Canada. You don't really see gang wars involving rappers like this in other parts of the country. And rappers like Pressa have seemingly moved successfully away from gang life into the music industry, putting Toronto's Jane and Finch rap scene on the international stage. Okay, moving on. When you're talking about gangs in Toronto, you have to mention the infamous Galloway Boys, also known as the Galloway Gang, G-Way, or the G-Way Boys. They were formed in the 1980s in Scarborough by a group of friends selling drugs. In the early 2000s, they were at odds with the Orton Park Gang for control of the area's drug trade. On October 10th of 2002, then leader of the Galloway Boys, Norris Allen, was shot to death while he was sitting in his car. A man named Tashawn Riley then assumed leadership of the gang, and the group became more organized under his leadership. By now, they had expanded beyond drug dealing to weapons distribution and prostitution, along with other activities. The gang had a special assassin squad within the group called the Throwbacks that carried out hits against rivals. In 2003, the Galloway Boys stole a large cache of guns, which helped them aggressively combat rival gangs in the area and expand their territory. On March 3rd of 2004, two men named Leonard Bell and Brenton Charlton, both of whom had no gang affiliation whatsoever, were in their car stopped at a red light when they were noticed by Galloway Boys leader Tashawn Riley, who shot them multiple times, mistaking them for members of a rival gang called the Malvern Crew. Brenton Charlton was killed and Leonard Bell was severely injured in the shooting. At the time of the shooting, Tashawn Riley was with Galloway Boys members Philip Atkins and Jason Wisdom. All three men were arrested, and at their trial in 2009, the jury found Riley guilty of first-degree murder and he received a life sentence. This trial was one of the most expensive in Toronto's history. On December 30th of 2011, in another case of mistaken identity, the Galloway Boys shot and killed Demetra Barnaby in Scarborough. Police disclosed that the intended target also lived in the neighborhood, but they would not reveal his identity. On July 16th of 2012, on Danzig Street, there was a party to celebrate a local street festival, and this area is also a Galloway Boys stronghold. This neighborhood party was in full force, everyone having a good time, when all of a sudden bullets started flying. Over 23 people were injured and 2 people were killed, a 14-year-old girl and a 20-year-old man. And there was even a 22-month-old baby among those wounded by bullets. And this was really one of the biggest mass shootings in Toronto's history. Initially, this was thought to be a turf war between the Galloway Boys and the Malvern Crew, but it was later determined that the shooting was not part of a territorial dispute. Rather, it was a disagreement between teenagers who then had a gunfight at this party. But the Galloway Boys did have a strong influence on the violent culture of this area. A few months later, in September of 2012, Toronto police launched Project Brazen, which saw 54 charges against 9 members of the Galloway Boys and the Orton Park Gang. In June of 2013, Toronto police launched Project Quell, which saw another 7 people arrested and 138 charges laid. Although the Galloway Boys have kept a lower profile in the past decade, they are still very much active in the Scarborough area, and they are a prominent gang in Toronto's underworld history. Toronto has also seen significant activity involving Jamaican posse gangs. Essentially, these are gangs that originated in Jamaica in the 1980s, and they were involved in trafficking weapons and drugs. The Jamaican posse groups have ties to Jamaica's main political parties, the Jamaican Labour Party as well as the People's National Party. Over time, these Jamaican posse groups spread internationally as people from Jamaica began emigrating to different countries around the world. Jamaican gangs began establishing themselves across London, England, where they are often referred to as yardies. They also set up in cities in North America like New York City, Philadelphia, and Toronto. The most infamous of these Jamaican criminal groups is called the Shower Posse. This group was formed in the 1980s in the Tivoli Gardens neighborhood of Kingston, Jamaica, by Lester Lloyd Coke and Vivian Blake. They are known to have ties with the Jamaican Labour Party, and they soon began establishing themselves in major cities across North America, trafficking cocaine, marijuana, and weapons. The Shower Posse began affiliating with multiple smaller groups within the city of Toronto. They have been linked to the Southside Falstaff Crips, also known as the Brown Bricks Group. I mentioned earlier when talking about the 5 Point Generalz gang that in 2009 there was a bloody war between them and the Falstaff Crips. In 2010, Toronto Police's Project Corral saw massive raids and arrests on both sides of the conflict, and police stated during during their investigations and arrests that the Shower Posse gang had been supplying weapons to both the 5 Point Generalz as well as the Falstaff Crips. The Shower Posse has also been linked with the Malvern crew. This gang originated in Scarborough in the mid-90s, and they are noted for their significant conflicts with the Galloway Boys. After the massive Project Corral saw several of Toronto's Shower Posse arrested in 2010, Toronto Police Chief Bill Blair stated that this was a massive hit to organized crime in the city, and that 2011 saw Toronto's homicide rate drop to a 25-year low. In 2009, a massive Toronto police operation dubbed Project Fusion culminated in the arrest of 125 people. Police targeted two gangs that had been working together, MNE as well as the 400 crew, and these groups had been dealing weapons and drugs throughout the GTA. It was thought that the Shower Posse was connected to both of these groups and supplied both of them with various drugs and weapons using their international connections. Essentially, the Shower Posse was a large international syndicate that supplied contraband to smaller street gangs throughout Toronto. In 2010, then leader of the Shower Posse named Christopher Koch, otherwise known as Dudus, was arrested in the US and sentenced to 23 years in US prison in 2012. This destabilized the group internationally and led to massive unrest and violence in Kingston, Jamaica. This group has steadily declined in prominence over time, and even though they're an international syndicate originating in Jamaica, the Shower Posse definitely earned a reputation as one of Toronto's most infamous gangs. And I'm going to finish off this part 1 video with the Black Axe. The Black Axe is an international confraternity originating in Nigeria. A confraternity is a society devoted to a religious or charitable cause, and Nigerian confraternities are secretive student groups within Nigeria's post-secondary institutions that have been involved in violence and crime since the 1980s. On July 7th of 1977, 9 students at the University of Benin in Nigeria, led by Nicholas Idamudia, started the Neo-Black Movement of Africa, a male brotherhood focused on intellectual radicalism in pursuit of Pan-African struggles. They adopted the logo of a black axe, representing smashing the shackles of colonialism, and this logo gave the group its common name, the Black Axe. They became prominent at Nigerian universities throughout the 1980s, and over time they became more radical and violent. They are partly known for their intense initiations. Initiates are forced to strip naked, lie in mud, and endure severe physical abuse, as well as crawl through their tormentors' legs in a process known as the Devil's Passage, and at times these initiation rituals involve the sexual assault of random people. Some members, usually first-year university students, are forcefully initiated. Black Axe leadership portrays the university environment as hostile, with the students in need of the gang's protection. Throughout the 90s and into the new millennium, the Black Axe group expanded their activities, particularly in the area of online fraud, and they also expanded their territory internationally, including the city of Toronto. Besides their activity in online fraud, the gang is also known to be involved in smuggling, dealing drugs and weapons, human trafficking, kidnapping, intimidation, as well as a variety of other activities. And up until fairly recently, they mostly avoided the headlines in Canada and remained relatively low-key. In 2013, Toronto police started investigating this group much more seriously. On October of 2015, after 2 years of gathering information on the Black Axe within Toronto, police laid charges against 3 men who defrauded a Toronto woman of $609,000, and one of these men was linked with the Black Axe. In December of 2015, Toronto police arrested 18 additional people and laid 640 charges, allegedly involved in the theft of 500 SUVs throughout the GTA, all worth about $30 million. According to Toronto police, these were not common thieves, but a highly sophisticated crime ring linked to the Black Axe that had people working for them in shipping companies and at a government agency. They had a professional locksmith, a full-service chop shop, and people receiving the cars in Ghana and Nigeria. Officers also found large amounts of drugs and guns during the arrests. The Black Axe would continue to expand their internet fraud operations and became especially known for this in Canada. And this gang is still very present in the city of Toronto. Just a couple months ago, in July of 2024, Toronto police, working with Interpol and other organizations investigating international fraud involving crime groups in West Africa, arrested 7 people in the Toronto area and charged them with defrauding victims to the tune of $1.3 million. This operation was dubbed Interpol Operation Jackal 3, and it actually resulted in around 300 arrests worldwide and highlighted the gang's continued presence in the city of Toronto, mainly scamming vulnerable people out of their money, but also involved in many other activities as well. And that pretty much wraps up this video. As I mentioned in the beginning, Toronto has a long history of gang activity, and there's a lot of content there. And so this is part 1 of a 3-part series, and I'm going to be posting parts 2 and 3 within a couple weeks. And I've already posted several videos on the gang activity in Western Canadian cities, and so you might find those interesting as well. I hope you found this one interesting and informative. informative, and if you'd like to watch more of my videos in general, please consider subscribing to my channel. I upload something new at least once a week. Thank you for watching. I hope you have a great day, and I look forward to seeing you next time on the Strange North channel.